The first thing I got rid of wasn't sentimental. It wasn't a decision I agonized over for weeks. It was a drawer full of oven mitts, 9 of them. And when I laid them all out on the counter, I actually counted them twice because I couldn't believe it. I hadn't bought most of them. They'd just accumulated, one at a time, over years, without me ever noticing the drawer getting fuller. A gift here, a freebie from a kitchen store, a replacement for one I thought I'd lost, before finding the original wedged behind the toaster months later. 9 of something I only ever needed 1 or 2 at a time. I stood there for a minute just looking at them spread across the counter, and I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. And also, this is exactly the point. Because if I had accumulated 9 oven mitts without ever deciding to, what else in this kitchen had I never actually decided to keep? So at 52, I went through my kitchen drawer by drawer and cabinet by cabinet, and I pulled out 25 things. A few of them I missed for about a day. Most of them I haven't thought about since. And I want to walk you through all of it, slowly, the way it actually happened, including the one I almost put back. I'm going to go through all 25 in the order I actually found them, because I think the reasoning behind each one matters more than the list itself. Some of these you'll agree with right away. A few, I suspect, you're going to want to argue with me about. And if you do, I genuinely want to hear it in the comments. As I went through this, I kept coming back to the same question for almost every item. Am I keeping this for the life I actually have right now, or for a version of myself that's already passed, or one I keep hoping I'll get around to someday? That question turned out to be what made every decision easier. I also didn't throw everything out in one emotional sweep, and I don't think you should either, if you try this yourself. I used 3 passes. First, I walked through with nothing in my hands, just noticing anything I couldn't remember using or anything that made me pause and think, why do I still have this? Second, I went back through and actually asked that question about each thing. And third, a full day later, I looked at everything one more time, because a couple of things I thought I'd part with easily, I actually needed to sit with overnight first. I'll tell you which ones when we get there. So, the oven mitts were the start. Just outside that drawer was a monogrammed cutting board. A gift from years ago, my initials carved into the corner in this elegant script. I remember unwrapping it and being genuinely touched by it. And then I remember putting it somewhere safe, propped against the backsplash, telling myself I'd use it for something special. That was years ago. I had never once actually cut on it. Not once. It had just stood there, leaned up like a piece of art, because somewhere along the way, I'd quietly decided it was too nice to actually use for its job. It had graduated from tool to ornament without me ever consciously making that decision, and I think that happens more than we realize. Then there was the recipe box, a little tin painted with flowers that had mostly worn off, decades old, filled with recipes clipped from magazines back when I was in my 30s and 40s. I sat down on the kitchen floor with that box and went through every single card, one at a time. Casseroles, layer cakes with 3 components, a chicken dish with some French name I don't even remember anymore, that I must have clipped out because it looked impressive. And going through them, I could count on one hand the recipes I'd actually cooked more than once. The rest were recipes of a life I imagined having. More dinner parties, more elaborate weeknight meals, more time in the evening than I actually had. I kept the 6 I genuinely loved and used. The rest went into the recycling bin, and it felt less like throwing out recipes and more like putting down an obligation I'd never actually agreed to in the first place. After that came a run of smaller things that moved a bit faster. A drawer of cloth napkins, folded and pressed, completely untouched, still holding their creases from however long ago I'd ironed them. An electric knife sharpener, still in its original box, that I bought with every intention of learning to use properly and never did. A set of decorative placemats bought for one specific holiday. Table setting years ago and never used again because that one year turned out to be the exception rather than the beginning of some new tradition. But the tablecloths took me longer. I had two good ones, the kind you're actually supposed to iron, folded carefully at the bottom of the drawer. And holding them, I could picture exactly the kind of table I used to set. 8 people, sometimes 10, if we pushed the leaf into the table, candles down the middle, everyone talking over each other by the second course. I hadn't set a table for 8 people in almost 10 years. My holidays look different now. Smaller, quieter, sometimes just a few of us at the kitchen counter instead of the dining room at all. Holding those tablecloths, I wasn't just holding fabric, I was holding a version of hosting that belonged to an earlier chapter of my life. And keeping them in that drawer wasn't bringing that chapter back. It was just taking up space for it. Those were the someday items, things I was saving for a version of life I hadn't actually been living. What came after that was different. This is where I think most people actually get stuck. Because it isn't about someday anymore. It's about a phase that already happened and already ended, except the evidence never actually left the kitchen. There was a dehydrator, this big awkward appliance I bought during a stretch when I decided I was going to make my own dried fruit and vegetable snacks, mostly for my grandkids when they'd visit. I was so sure this was going to become a regular thing. I used it for maybe 3 weeks. And then it sat on top of my refrigerator for the next 4 years, so high up I'd stopped even seeing it anymore, collecting the kind of dust that only comes from something being completely forgotten. There was a pasta attachment for my stand mixer, bought after I watched one too many videos of people rolling out these beautiful, delicate sheets of homemade pasta. I made pasta exactly twice. Cleaning that attachment took longer than eating the meal did both times, and after the second time, it just went into a box in the pantry and stayed there. A milk frother from a stretch when I was making lattes at home every single morning, like I was running my own little cafe off the kitchen counter. I'd actually stopped drinking coffee that way for over a year, before I finally admitted to myself the frother wasn't coming back into rotation. A salad spinner I used exactly twice before realizing a clean kitchen towel does the exact same job in half the time, with no extra piece of plastic to store. And a waffle iron bought for weekend mornings that, if I'm honest with myself, I don't really have anymore. My weekends are quieter now. There's no one asking for waffles on a Saturday. None of these were bad decisions in the moment. Each one represented something I genuinely wanted to try, or a version of my life I genuinely wanted to live. But wanting to try something and needing to keep the equipment for it forever turned out to be two very different things. If you've made it this far, is there something in your kitchen right now that represents a phase of your life you've already moved past? Not something you're embarrassed by, just something that's simply over. Tell me what it is in the comments and what phase it reminds you of. I read the comments and I genuinely want to hear these stories. But not everything I found had a story behind it. Some things weren't connected to a past version of me at all. They were simply there because I'd stopped noticing them completely. 3 sets of measuring cups from 3 different decades of my life, all doing the exact same job, none of them ever fully matching. A drawer of takeout condiment packets, saved just in case, some of them old enough I genuinely couldn't tell you which restaurant they came from anymore. 4 can openers, one of them broken, kept anyway, because somehow a broken can opener still felt like having a can opener, like getting rid of it meant admitting I'd have to actually go buy a replacement. And a set of mismatched water glasses, 3 different sets layered on top of each other over 3 different years, none of them ever fully replacing the last one, just adding to it. And then a stack of plastic cups, the kind with cartoon characters faded almost to nothing from the dishwasher, left over from when my kids were small. I picked one up and could still remember exactly which one belonged to which kid, even after all these years. The blue one always went to my youngest, without fail. Some rule none of us ever actually stated out loud. My kids are grown now. They have their own kitchens and their own cups. But those cups had stayed in my cabinet for years past their actual use, because getting rid of them felt in some small way like admitting that chapter was fully closed. That one took me longer than the can openers did. I stood there holding that blue cup for a while before I finally put it in the box. Everything up to this point was about habits, or about phases that had quietly ended on their own. What came next was about identity, and that's a very different kind of letting go. There was a fondue set from my 30s, from an era when I hosted dinner parties fairly often. I loved that stretch of my life, the noise of it, the planning, spending an entire afternoon getting the kitchen ready, my house actually full of people on a Saturday night. Dishes piled up by midnight because everyone stayed later than they meant to. I pulled that fondue set out of the back of the cabinet, and I actually put it in the donate box first thing. And then I stood there in my kitchen for a solid minute, picked the box back up, and seriously reconsidered it. It wasn't really about the pot. It never was. It was about whether letting go of it meant that whole part of my life was fully over. That version of me who threw dinner parties, who had a house full of noise on a Saturday. I stood there longer than I want to admit, turning that fondue pot over in my hands. And eventually I decided it didn't have to mean that. The memory doesn't live in the fondue pot. It lives in me. But I want to be honest with you. This decision wasn't as clean or as quick as some of the others. There was also a stock pot, enormous, heavier than it looks, bought for holiday cooking back when my whole extended family used to come through for the season. 15 people some years, spilling out of the kitchen into the living room. My gatherings are smaller now. A handful of people, a couple of days, nothing like it used to be. That pot was built for a kitchen full of people, and keeping it meant keeping space reserved for an occasion that doesn't happen that way for me anymore, at least not right now. A juicer from a health kick that lasted about 3 weeks before the cleanup became more work than the juice was ever worth. A popcorn machine from years and years of family movie nights when my kids still lived at home, and Friday nights meant blankets spread across the living room floor and everyone arguing over which movie to watch, and someone always falling asleep before the ending. And a set of steak knives given to me as a wedding gift for a marriage that didn't last. I used those knives for years afterward without ever really noticing what they represented. Just knives in a drawer, doing their job. And then one evening, standing at the counter with one of them in my hand, cutting into something completely ordinary, it hit me all at once. I didn't make a whole thing of it. I just finally understood what those knives represented. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Letting go of these things wasn't about pretending those chapters of my life never happened. They happened. They mattered. It was about realizing I don't need to store an object to keep the memory of them. The memory lives in me, not in the pot, or the knives, or the popcorn machine sitting untouched in a cabinet. By the time I got to the final part of the kitchen, I'd already gone through 22 items, and I'll be honest, I almost skipped it entirely, just to be done with the whole project. But this is where I found the ones that surprised me the most. Not because they were emotional, but because I genuinely couldn't explain why I still had them. A stack of appliance manuals for a microwave I no longer own, a blender I've replaced twice since, a toaster oven that broke years ago and was never fixed. None of the actual appliances were even in my kitchen anymore, but somehow the manuals had outlived every single thing they were meant to explain. And a pile of cookbooks I kept mostly for the photography, if I'm honest, not the recipes. Beautiful books I'd flip through occasionally on a quiet Sunday afternoon, but almost never actually cook from. And then, the very last one, a chair wedged into the corner of my kitchen that didn't match any of my other seating at all. Different wood, different height, clearly from somewhere else entirely. I told myself every time I noticed it that I kept it in case someone visits. But when I actually stopped and thought about it, really thought about it, that chair had sat empty in that corner for over 2 years. It wasn't making room for guests. It was taking up room I could have used for something I actually needed, in the name of a possibility that almost never came. Of everything on this list, I think that chair might say the most. I'll say this clearly because I don't want to pretend this was tidier than it actually was. Getting rid of these 25 things didn't make my kitchen perfect, and it doesn't mean nothing new accumulates. A few weeks later, I caught myself starting to keep a takeout bag, just in case. The exact same instinct all over again. That's normal. This was never about getting it perfect once. It's a habit I keep coming back to now, a drawer at a time, every few months. So that's all 25, from 9 oven mitts to a chair I was keeping for guests who almost never came. Looking around my kitchen now, I genuinely don't miss any of them. What I keep thinking about instead is your kitchen. What's sitting in a cabinet somewhere right now, still being kept for a life that already ended, or one that never quite started? Which one of these would you never let go of? Tell me what it is and why in the comments. I think that answer says just as much about you as it does about your kitchen. And if you're at a point in your life where you're figuring out what actually deserves space in your home, that's exactly what this channel is here for. I'll see you in the next one.